In the spring of 1971, toward the end of my sophomore year in college, I hitchhiked to Washington, D.C. for a protest march with a couple of boys from an off-campus, non-fraternity house known locally as The Dump. Neither of them was in any way politically active. Neither of them was what you might consider a passionate advocate of peace and justice. Both of them were prematurely postmodern cynics, suspicious of anything like earnest idealism. I was an earnest idealist. We were not perfect traveling companions. But they both had relatively low draft numbers and a genuine desire to avoid going to Vietnam. And they thought that hitchhiking with a cute girl would make it easier for them to get rides. I had never hitchhiked before, and I thought it would be a good idea to have some companions, perfect or otherwise. And it was May, and we were young and restless, and so we went. There were a couple 100,000 protesters in Washington that weekend, maybe 500,000, in our bell-bottoms and mini-skirts and our army fatigues, with our long hair and beards and flowers and guitars and bare feet. And not all of us were hippies. Not all of us were young. There were moms and grandparents, teachers and ministers and nurses. There were clean-cut high school students and congressional aides and construction workers. Maybe some of you were there. As I recall, it was mostly peaceful. There may have been some angry veterans, some professional agitators. There may have been some flags and draft cards burned, some medals flung, maybe some arrests when people handcuffed themselves to the White House fence. But not that we were involved in. We marched, we chanted. We offered flowers and peace signs to the police lining the streets. We inadvertently obstructed traffic. At some point, before the march, I think, we got a ride downtown in a limousine with a baffled diplomat from the French embassy who wanted us to explain young people to him. But the traffic was so gridlocked that it was actually faster to walk, and so we left him to figure it out for himself. We sat on the grass on the mall between the Capitol and the Washington Monument, getting sunburned, trying not to be crushed or trampled, listening to speakers so far away that we couldn't see them. Noon and afternoon came and went, and we were hungry, but any restaurant that we could afford was so crowded that there was no hope of finding anything to eat. And sadly, nobody offered to turn a few loaves and fishes into enough to feed the throng. But we drank a lot of cheap red wine, and people were more than happy to pass around their marijuana. We heard a lot of music by mostly non-famous musicians and a lot of mostly bad poetry from non-famous poets late into the night. We slept for a few hours on the floor of somebody's dorm room at American University, and then we hitched back home. I can't say it was a formative experience. It was kind of a party, maybe at most a rite of passage. In retrospect, I feel as though my presence at that protest was somewhat shallow. Not that I did not oppose the war. I did. I was an earnest idealist. I was a child of my times in my social class. I thought war was always wrong. I thought that communism was not necessarily evil. I thought we had no business interfering in and probably prolonging what was essentially a civil war. But I wasn't convinced of the efficacy of our protest. I did not believe that Richard Nixon was going to look out the White House window and see us marching and be seized by a Saul on the road to Damascus moment. I did not believe that previously hawkish voters who saw us marching would find themselves moved to give peace a chance, or the Green Berets who heard our songs would lay down their weapons and vow to make war no more. I was there for the party, for the cultural experience. Frivolous, I admit. But people protest for all sorts of reasons. Some of them may be more laudable than others. Consider the Boston Tea Party. On a bitterly cold night in December, almost 200 years before my own inaugural protest, 60 men belonging to a group called the Sons of Liberty, dressed up unconvincingly as Indians in blankets and war paint and feathers, rowed some very heavy, very crowded boats across what must have been very icy waters, disarmed whatever security guards had been in place, and dumped about $3 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor. They didn't steal the tea, mind you. If any one of the fake Indians had been seen to pocket a handful of tea leaves with the hope of taking it home for breakfast, his brothers unceremoniously dumped him into the harbor along with the tea. The point was to destroy the tea. A handbill that was posted around the city read, "Friends, brethren, countrymen, that worst of plagues, the detested tea, shipped for this port by the East India Company, is now arrived in the harbor. The hour of destruction, of manly opposition to the machinations of tyranny, stares you in the face." What was this about? Why was the tea so detested? I'm sure that some of you have been watching Ken Burns' Revolutionary War documentary, and you know the answer is a little more complicated than we learned in elementary school. But basically, the answer is taxes. Those of the colonists inclined to be critical of their English overlords objected to the tax on tea. In fact, they objected so much that they had stopped drinking English tea. This resulted in a glut of tea in England and likely financial ruin for the East India Company. But apparently, the East India Company, like General Motors 200 years later, was too big to fail. So in 1773, the British government passed the Tea Act, which allowed the East India Company to sell directly to the colonies without having to go through a middleman. This made East India tea much more affordable, even with the tax, and some of the less patriotic colonists more willing to drink it. But for the patriots, the price of tea wasn't the issue. The tax on tea was the issue, a tax imposed by Parliament in which they had no representation, a tax which supported a government which would never recognize them as full citizens or act in their interests. Destroying the tea was a declaration to England that the colonists would not be a party to their own subjection, and a reprimand to their non-patriotic neighbors that they had better learn to like coffee. The day after the Tea Party, John Adams wrote in his diary, "This is the most magnificent movement of all. There's a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the patriots that I greatly admire. The people should never rise without doing something to be remembered, something notable and striking. This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences and so lasting that I can't but consider it as an epoch in history." I can't help thinking that Adams has overstated his case here. Dignity, majesty, and sublimity are hardly terms that spring to mind when describing a very expensive act of vandalism by a handful of wild and crazy guys in ragtag Halloween costumes. Adams may have seen this as the first step in a revolutionary war and the first step on the road to independence, but that goal was so far off, more than 10 years, and so unlikely, given the might of the British military machine, that it would be more realistic to describe the Tea Party as simply an expression of defiance, a thumbing of the collective nose, rather than as a serious act of opposition to tyranny, or even a serious declaration of intent to rebel. I doubt if many of the Tea Partiers expected that King George would be more than mildly annoyed. This is not to say that the Sons of Liberty were merely frivolous. I don't think that they were there just for the cultural experience. It was too cold, too wet, really too dangerous for anyone to consider it a lark. But maybe, in addition to a shared wish to flip off the king, there was a shared desire for a better world, a sense of community, of common cause among the patriots, a feeling that might also be attributed to many of the thousands who marched 2 centuries later against the war in Vietnam. And maybe that shared ideal lent some dignity and majesty to the protest, regardless of its probable futility. Let me say a little more about futility here. It doesn't seem promising to begin any enterprise with an expectation that it isn't going to succeed. We all grew up with the story of the little engine that thought it could pull an impossibly loaded train over an enormous mountain. Remember that? I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. And the moral of the story was, you can do anything if you put your mind to it. Optimism wins the day. Never say never. However, in spite of that little engine, I believe there's a sense in which pessimism, or even despair, is a central component of political protest. Let's talk about the Freedom Riders. In 1955, the Interstate Commerce Commission ruled that public transportation was a form of interstate commerce, and that it was therefore subject to federal law prohibiting discrimination in interstate commerce. But the ICC did nothing to enforce this ruling. Racial discrimination in public transportation continued to be the norm, particularly in southern states. People of color were forced to buy their tickets at the front of the bus and then exit the bus and enter again at the back, Why? So that white passengers wouldn't have to endure the apparently horrific experience of black people walking too close to them through the aisles to get to the back of the bus. People of color were, of course, required to sit at the back of the bus and to give up their seats to later arriving white passengers if seating was inadequate. Bus terminals had separate restaurants, separate toilets, separate drinking fountains for whites and for blacks. Officially, the law frowned on this. In 1960, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in interstate transportation was illegal. But again, law enforcement agencies seemed to feel that it was best to leave well enough alone. Even well-meaning officials counseled impatient Negroes to be patient. Segregation was a way of life in the South, they pointed out. It had been so for centuries. It could not be changed overnight. This followed the same pattern that had been observed in Montgomery, Alabama. The municipal boycott there had been effective in bringing about a change in the laws, but practices had not really changed. 4 years after the boycott, most black citizens of Montgomery still rode in the back of the bus. David Halberstam refers to the young civil rights workers who finally addressed this as the children. John Lewis was 21 years old. Bernard Lafayette was 20. Joan Mulholland was 19. Hank Thomas and Charles Person were 18. There were maybe 400 freedom riders between May and December of 1961, and 75% of them were under 30 years old. All of them were committed to nonviolence in the face of whatever wrath they might incur. Their plan was to board a Greyhound bus in Washington and ride it through the South to arrive in New Orleans 2 weeks later. During the ride, they would be polite and well-behaved, but they would deliberately violate all of the illegal Jim Crow laws. They would enter the bus at the front door, not the back. Some of them would take seats in the front of the bus. They would sit in mixed-race couples. At bus depots, they would use bathrooms and drinking fountains in restaurants designated for the other race. And for this, they were attacked with all the fury that the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Councils could muster. Beginning in South Carolina, they were met at one stop after another by enraged men with baseball bats and iron pipes, bicycle chains, and broken Coke bottles. Firebombs were thrown through bus windows. Riders were hauled out of buses and beaten senseless. On Mother's Day, May 14th, in Anniston, Alabama, the tires on the bus were slashed to ribbons, and when the crippled bus came to a stop, it was overturned by howling men and set on fire, the doors deliberately jammed to prevent the riders from escaping. Many of the people in the mob were still dressed in their Sunday go-to-church clothes, having been summoned from worship when the bus driver called ahead to the local Grand Dragon to alert them, like volunteer lynch squads. A second bus arrived in Anniston the same day. Its passengers were beaten, and then when the bus went on to Birmingham, they were attacked by another mob, which had waited hours for the opportunity, and beaten again. The only people arrested after these attacks were the riders, who were held without bail. State police and local sheriffs did little to protect them, except when directly ordered to do so by reluctant governors, prompted by an increasingly concerned federal government. Hospitals often refused to treat the riders. And yet, these young people got back onto the buses again and again and again, knowing that they would be beaten again, knowing that they might very well be killed. You have to wonder how they found the courage to continue. I don't think it was because they were optimistic. On the contrary, I think they were fatalists. They expected to die, but they would rather die than abandon or disappoint the people they rode with. Their cause, they believed, was worth dying for. And if they didn't stand up for it, no one else would. This isn't to say that the freedom rides were not strategic, that there was no expectation of eventual success. Every time they were attacked, increasingly large segments of the population found it increasingly difficult to turn their heads and pretend they hadn't seen. White citizens were ashamed. White politicians were embarrassed. The cause of racial justice was certainly advanced by the willingness of the freedom riders to put their lives on the line. But when a person is standing in the door of a bus, watching a screaming mob approach with baseball bats, faces distorted by hatred, it's hard to imagine that a distant hope of equality for one's people is what gives that person the strength to stay standing. Standing becomes an end in itself. The dignity and majesty that John Adams found in the Boston Tea Party is manifest here, I believe, in that simple determination to take a stand and not back down, regardless of the consequences. Is there something for us to learn here? Many of us have participated in protests this year because we've been filled with anger by Trump's attacks on the institutions of democracy and horrified by the spectacle of men in masks grabbing people for deportation without any kind of due process, because we've been moved to despair by the reduction of Gaza to rubble and by the inexorable advance of Russian soldiers into Ukrainian cities. So far, for myself at least, it hasn't taken a lot of courage to march in a crowd of 2,000 shouting, "This is what democracy looks like." But I think that in the days and years ahead, we would do well to remind ourselves of the spirit of community and the hope for a better world, and of the simple determination to stand up that motivated the Freedom Riders and the Tea Partiers and the anti-war demonstrators of the 70s, and to look for ways to reinforce those sentiments in ourselves and in our friends. Because if we don't stand up, no one else will either.